everyone. I'm Molly Stryback, Director of Postdoctoral Services, and I would like to welcome you to the Responsible Conduct of Research Seminar on Financial Stewardship. This seminar will be conducted by our two very qualified speakers, Mariah Brass, who is the Associate Dean for Administration for the School of Medicine, and Molly Sykes, who is Senior Business Manager for Cell Biology and was formerly the Associate Dean for Research Administration, so they know whereof they speak. They're going to discuss how to prudently and ethically manage the federal, institutional, or foundation dollars entrusted to you for your research. Because when you're a PI, guess what? You don't get to just do research. You have to do a whole bunch of paperwork too. So, without further ado, Molly and Mariah, thank you.
Thanks for having us this morning. Before we get started, we just wanted to poll the audience a little bit to see who you all are. So, how many of you are graduate students? Most of you. Postdocs? Oh, that's a fair one. And other? Okay. That helps us as we sort of talk about things and answer questions. So we got a pretty good mix between graduate students and postdocs. Just to start off, we've been doing this we do this class for y'all, and we also do it for junior faculty, slightly different questions, but so it is definitely designed to answer questions as we go through the material. I don't think we've ever, in any class we've ever taught this, made it all the way through the slide set because there's always so many different questions. So we'd rather just take them as we go because we bounce to a lot of different topics, and if you wait till the end, you're going to forget it because we're going to be on to something totally different. So just feel free to ask questions as we work our way through it. We'll sort of bounce back and forth between Molly and I on different topics based on sort of our expertise and what we like to talk about. So, there we go. What is expected of you as a faculty member? You know, when you're at the beginning, you're all here about the science, but there's a whole lot more than just the science. So what do you have to do with that? You really have to be contributing and helping. We're going to use the framework of Duke, but understand that you could be anywhere. You know, Duke is where you're at right now, but when you're faculty, chances are you're not going to be at Duke. You're going to be at another institution. But you're going to be expected to contribute to your department, to your school, to the university or a hospital. Some of you will be in sort of more clinical settings, and that contribution is expected. And to make it a better place, not only from scientific enrichment, but financially. There's financial responsibilities that come with being a faculty member. You have to be, in the end, self-supporting. Unless you're at a very unique place, unless you're from another country and you go home and you're working in Europe where it's a whole different framework, although even there it's changing a lot in today's economic environment, and they're really struggling. But it's expected that you become self-supporting. Initially, you'll have what's called a startup package. But if you blow through your startup package without getting the funding, you're then really in a world of hurt. So you have to be very quickly thinking about how am I going to be self-supporting. You can't just be relying on somebody else that's doling you out money. There are some very few special positions, but they're generally not till you're quite a way down your career that become available, like HHMI and other institutions where it's a little bit different. Nobody can rely on those because they're very few and far between. You have to sustain your entire research program. And that's, we were talking about it before. It's the amount of time that you have to spend thinking about getting grants is enormous. And it's always kind of an eye-opener, I think, for new faculty of how much time. It's a constant chase. No sooner is one out the door when you're writing your next one, or they may even be overlapping in order to do that, because the acceptance rate, especially nowadays, is so low. You have to put in a lot of grants to get them. And the other side of it is the harsh reality is you have to think about your science in terms of what's fundable. I have many friends who are faculty who would love to be able to just do what they really, really love, but that aspect of their science is maybe not fundable. So they have to sort of go down an avenue that's on the same pathway, but it's the more fundable side. And that's the reality, because it doesn't matter if you're doing fabulous science. If nobody's going to fund it, it's not going to happen because it's expensive. So you have to be thinking in those terms as well. It's not selling out. If you're going to think of it as selling out, then you might want to think about another career, because if it's not fundable, you can't do it. So it's how do you find that balance? It's just the reality. Becoming a taxpayer, what does that mean? Well, I'll use Duke as an example. Understand every institution is different, but the grants bring in indirects. Everybody knows what indirects are. It's the portion that's not directly expensed on your grant. So it's not salaries, it's not the cost of the science, but it's the cost of the space that you're in, the utilities to run the space, the overhead costs for everybody getting a paycheck. All those kinds of things are covered in the indirects. It's a percentage that's added on the top of your grant. So if the federal government gives you $200,000, then they give the institution 56, 65, whatever, depending on your place that you work, that much on top of it to cover those other costs. Well, that's kind of where if you're not bringing in grant money, you're not covering your space costs either. That's how the institution recoups it, is with those indirects. And those are real costs to the institution. So when you're on startup, you're paying for your direct costs, and your department or the institution is paying for all those other costs with no money coming in to cover them. You don't see them anywhere necessarily. Some departments may track them, but that's real. And in the end, you have to be bringing in money not only to cover the direct costs that you see, but all those costs that are institutional costs for doing science. That's an expectation, because the school can't afford to have people not bringing in money to cover those things. Research is hugely expensive, and a big chunk of it is not visible to the faculty. It's not salaries, it's not supplies, it's not animals, things like that. Questions? Yep.
When does the clock start that you have to start paying your indirect costs off your grant? Because you said you have your startup, and then it's hidden. Is it when you burn that money?
When you have a grant.
Okay.
If you have a grant, there will be indirect costs.
Okay.
At Duke, I don't even remember what the current rate is because I don't do it in my job, but there's a standard, there's a negotiated rate with the federal government,
Okay.
whatever institution you're at. That's the federal rate. And then there may be different rates on foundations.
Okay.
Some of them set it that they say this is all we'll pay of indirects
Right.
of a certain percentage.
Okay.
So, but if you have a grant, there will be indirects on it.
Even if you come in with a grant and have a startup?
If you come in with a grant, you may have a grant and a startup, but startup, there's no charge. It's
Right.
just you're using this money. It's institutional funds that they've given you to get your research going.
Right.
A grant that an outside entity has granted you, there will be indirects on that at whatever the appropriate percentage is. So when you have a grant, you will have indirects that are being charged and collected by the institution. Any other questions? Yep.
Is there a minimum amount of money in where you have to, like the minimum amount of the grant that you have to start paying that? Because if there are grants that are not that big, you still have to pay that.
Typically, all grants have indirects. And it's not that you're paying it, it's the people that are giving the money to Duke that's part of the package that's negotiated up front. There may be a rare exception where there's no indirects, but those have to, within Duke, they have to be approved at a very high level to allow you to even bring that grant into the institution if there's no indirects on it. Because basically that's Duke saying, we're going to pay all those costs and you're going to take this money from the outside world. So it has to be approved by the vice dean that we even accept a grant where the foundation says we won't pay any indirects. And that's rare. Could be a much smaller percentage than the federal. That's not that uncommon. But to have none would be extremely unusual. Now, where you all might see them is on fellowships. A lot of times there's no indirects, or they're very small, because there's no, it's different type. But a research grant, typically you always have indirects on it. But that's part of the package up front in the application for it and the negotiation of the receipt of the grant itself. Yep.
So, sorry if this is a dumb question, but so if you get a grant for $500,000 worth of equipment and salary, then the agency needs to add to that the indirect costs of the university?
Yeah, and they know that. That's normal practice, particularly if it's a federal grant or any foundation. They're all very familiar with that. And there's certain things that they don't pay indirects on, like equipment. The feds don't give us any money on equipment because there's no real overhead cost. So that's standard operating procedure within the funding world, that there's an indirect cost that goes to the institution to cover those types of expenses.
Does that percentage influence the strength of your proposal?
No. Typically, that it's set. Like the federal government, they know that it's always there.
It varies from school to school, so
Yeah.
if there's another school that took that requirement.
It's not even it's just in the calculations that's done at the end for the budget for the actual awarding of the grant. It's not factored in for the scientific proposal or anything like that. So it's not going to impact you. I mean, there's some. I mean, what is our current percentage?
57.
57. I mean, I've seen some institutions that are up near 100% indirects. I saw one that was like 105. I was like, wow. So they vary significantly from one institution, but it's negotiated directly by the federal government. They come in and they go through our books to validate that that's the number, and then there's all kinds of, I mean, it's a year-long negotiation process, sometimes worse, to come to that percentage with the federal government. So.
And how is it, I'm sorry, how is it determined with other institutions?
The same way?
Okay.
Well, do you mean like between Duke and a foundation, or?
Yeah.
Well, typically, it's expected that they'll pay the federally negotiated rate unless they have a publicized rate that this is all we pay. You know, like American Heart, I think it used to be 10%. It was publicized on their website everywhere. We pay 10% only, and then Duke just has to accept that. If they don't have a published rate, then our expectation is they pay the federal rate. Yep.
So I'm a little confused. The 57, is it fixed? So for example, 2 PIs have a similar size lab. So in essence, Duke would have a similar cost providing services to both of them. One PI has grants totaling $2 million. The other PI, for example, has a grant totaling just $1 million. So 57% of the $2 million and also 57% of the $1 million?
Yes.
Okay.
The percentages come up through an aggregate calculation that's across the entire institution, not just the School of Medicine, the entire institution. It's based on the total research portfolio of Duke and then the overhead costs of Duke. So you can't extrapolate it down to the individual level. It's a calculation done for the entire institution. And then it's held, that's the percentage across the institution. So it's not done by PI, it's institution-wide. It's whether you're in the Department of Chemistry, Physics, cell biology, neurobiology, it doesn't matter. It's an institution-wide calculation.
So if I could just reframe that a little bit to have you think about it in the future. When you're in your lab and you're doing research, you need people, you need supplies, you need equipment, right? But you also need a lab, right? You need electricity, you need heating, air conditioning, you need a procurement service so that you can buy things, you need a payroll service so that you can pay your people, you need lots of infrastructure support. The F&A F&A stands for Facilities and Administration. So the facilities portion of the F&A cost goes to pay the physical buildings that we have on our campus that support research activities. The administrative cost goes to support all of the folks within the buildings to pay for administration. That includes the president's office, procurement, payroll, sponsored programs, tax people, all of the folks that are taking care of the administrative part so that you can do your research. So even though it's in addition to your direct costs, those are real costs that the institution incurs in order to allow you to do your research. So they are true cost, and that's why they're so expensive. So,
Yep.
all to say,
Right, all to say, money will occupy a huge percentage of your time and your thoughts and be somewhat stressful, I would say. Right up there next to people management. You know, the science y'all will have down pat, right? You know, the science, that's what you're here for, that's what you know, that's what you love. The stressful part is, how do I get the money and how do I manage the people that are in my lab? Because typically those are new endeavors when you become faculty that you're not really experienced at. But it is a lot of time on financial. Funding sources. Here's some of the places where you get money. Going in as a new faculty member, you have a startup package. Negotiate it with all you're worth. Get the best package you can get out of wherever you're going. And that varies tremendously depending on, you know, where you're going, the current economic situation, but do the best job you can negotiating your startup package going in. It's really important because that's what you're going to live and breathe on until you can get grants. Then you have grants, contracts, research agreements. So this could be anywhere from your R01s, R21s, federal grants, research contracts. Some of them are federal, some may be with, depending on your type of research, with pharmaceutical companies or other things. Research agreements get into more clinical. You could have clinical revenue, although in this group, I'm guessing probably not. I didn't see that. But some people who are clinician scientists, that's part of where they get into it. Hospital support, once again, typically only if you're a clinician scientist, you get that kind of support, or if you're doing very specialized research that's a much more clinical application. Internal sources, there's a lot of entities within Duke, and most institutions I'm sure have this as well. Centers and institutes, even the School of Medicine and the university, they have various pilot programs or small research opportunities where it's a way to get money. Usually it's in small dollar amounts. It might be $10,000, it might be $50,000 for sort of a pilot idea to then jumpstart research in order to get preliminary data to write a grant. So you want to, as you're not when you're brand new, because you have your startup and really your focus is getting your lab up and running, but then when it's like, okay, I don't have any grants, I need more, where do I look? Look inside the institution. A lot of times there's places there to tap into small research money to help you move it forward. And then philanthropy, once again, that's not typically available with a brand new person. Certainly, though, with this, as you move on in your career, if you're doing something very cutting edge or with a lot of, I don't know what I call sexy science, then there's philanthropic opportunities sometimes where people will give you money to do research. It's hard to believe that those, they're out there, and you see them. Now you see a lot more of that with clinician scientists because they'll have rich patients who just they save their kid's life or something, but you see it as well in other types of science where you have philanthropic giving. So those are the places where you can get money. So now you're there. How do you get started? Really think and learn the organizational structure of your new institution. When you're a new faculty member, don't just sit back and think only about your science. You really need to learn how the organizational structure works within your institution so you can take advantage of it and be familiar with it and not get blindsided by, but I didn't understand that. Become not necessarily friends, but really good colleagues with the business manager for the unit that you're in. Talk to them, meet with them, understand how the system works, have them become your mentor for financial. That's what they're there for, as well as a lot of other things, but that's one of the roles that they should be playing. So really work with them, know who they are, and know what's expected of you. Some places, even within Duke, it varies tremendously from one department to the next of what might be expected from you. Make sure you understand that, both scientifically, that's a lot easier, but financially, what is that expectation? You know, when do they expect you to be getting grants? When, you know, how long is your startup supposed to last? How long is it really going to last? What are the processes? Don't just focus on your science and not be thinking about those other things, or that will be to your detriment in the long run. Now I'm going to let Molly talk about specifics.
Okay. The first thing you want to do when you are looking for another position, a faculty position, is you want to create an operating budget. And this can be your startup package if that's what you're working with when you're going to a new institution. But an operating budget tells you what it's going to cost to run your lab. And there are specific things that you will need to consider in growing your lab, or what you plan to do over a period of time, your 2 to 3 years of startup. As Mariah mentioned earlier, different institutions have very different startup packages. It depends on whether you go to a private institution like Duke, an institution that is extremely well endowed like Harvard, or a state school like UNC. UNC several years ago, I'm not sure what their requirement is now, but several years ago, they required every faculty member to bring in 35% of their effort. Duke requires every faculty member to bring in at least 50% of their effort, if not more. So other institutions may have these sort of frameworks of expectations of how much external support you're expected to bring in. You also need to consider your progress regarding tenure and promotion, because assuming you've taken an academic position, your next step is that promotion or that tenure in a tenure track and the tenure track obtainment. So you want to make sure that you understand what your tenure track time frame is. It differs between the type of appointment that you have and the institution that you're in. So it may be 5 years, it may be 8 years, it may be 10 years, but you need to know that time frame as you work through and prepare to grow your research program. And I know that sounds like a long time, 10 years. Why would anybody want to be talking about a 10-year frame? But you really need to think about it the minute you walk into that position and start preparing yourself so that you're not caught off guard and you're not prepared when that promotion time comes up and that tenure consideration is made. So creating and operating for your budget when you first start up your lab is the most important thing you can do from a financial point of view. Your package will probably contain things like renovation cost. It may contain some equipment cost, which are usually major if you have large equipment in your field of expertise. But the day-to-day costs will be the payroll of the staff that you have in your office, any general supplies that you require to do your research, and depending on the type of research, that can be a lot or a little. If you're doing Drosophila or yeast, it's probably a little. You're doing gene sequencing, it's probably a lot. So you need to know how much it's going to actually cost you to do your research on an ongoing basis. If you have animals, there are costs. At Duke, there's what we call a per diem to maintain your animals in the vivarium. Every institution will have a per diem cost or a housing cost or a husbandry cost. They'll name it different things, but every institution has a cost for you to house your animals. And they have additional costs. So if your cages get too crowded and they have to separate your cages and you don't do it yourself, they will charge you to do that. If you have to euthanize your animals, there may be a charge to do that. So animal costs, for those of researchers that do use animals as models, that is one of the most expensive line items that they have because it's ongoing. Typically, you have a colony, and you have to maintain that colony, and it can go up to $100,000 a year to maintain a large colony. So animal cost is something that you have to pay very close attention to, and you really have to manage on a day-to-day basis. Core facilities. If you're in an investigator's lab at the moment, your mentor's lab, and you need to go use the confocal microscope, you probably just go sign up for it and go use it. But every time you use a core facility, there's a cost, and that cost comes back to that investigator. So if you need core facilities within your institution for your research, you need to understand what those costs are and then manage those costs. If you're a graduate student in a lab right now, you may have experienced the lab manager saying, we're going to delay this experiment until next month because we're out of supply dollars for this month. If you haven't experienced that, you may in the future, because faculty and investigators, if they have multiple people in their labs and running multiple lines of research or interest, then they actually have to plan the experiments to sort of monitor their money. You don't want to run out of money and at the end of the year not have money to do experiments. So you have to be very careful with that. Something that usually surprises people, you have to do service contracts on your equipment. So when you start your lab up and you're buying a lot of equipment, brand new equipment to get you off the ground, to get you started, most equipment a year out will run into a service contract. Those service contracts can range from $500 to $5,000 to $25,000. So you need to make sure that you understand the cost of your service contracts. Do you have to have an alarm in the background? Do you need an emergency alarm? If your freezer goes out in the middle of the night, do you need to be someone to call you to say your freezer's off and all your samples are defrosting? If you need an alarm, that will cost you. That is not part of the ongoing expense of your lab. So there are a lot of hidden costs, and you need to think through these. And this is where Mariah said, make your business manager your friend, or at least a very nice colleague, bring them a cup of coffee.
Chocolate works too.
Chocolate works too. Your business manager or your grant manager in your area can certainly help you think through these issues. I just had a new faculty member who's going out west, and we sat down, and not only did I read his offer letter to talk about negotiating his package, but we also talked about operating cost, so that he would have a better understanding of what it actually costs to run a lab, at least with Duke, and he has to apply that to the institution where he's going. Those are what we call unanticipated costs. In our department, cell biology, if you need a dishwasher, you have to pay for it. If you need media, you have to pay for it. So don't assume that services that you have as a grad student that your investigator is actually paying for that you're not aware of will be available to you when you run your own independent lab. You need to ask those questions, and you need to make sure that you've included them in your operating budget. Questions?
One thing it's on there, but I want to make sure it gets mentioned because I had a lot of junior faculty that didn't know this. Most vendors offer huge discounts for startup faculty, way beyond any other discount that is available for anybody else. And that typically, for a lot of them, for VWR, by a lot of the big ones, it's not only on the big pieces of equipment, but it's on that initial order of all the supplies to stock your lab. Make sure you're asking that question of your vendors when you're starting up your lab, because we had some people that didn't know that in the department that I came into, and they basically paid full price. I mean, I'm talking discounts of anywhere from 50 to 60% is not uncommon for startup. It's only good for that initial period, and then you're back like everybody else getting whatever the negotiated Duke rate is or institutional rate. But there are many of the big vendors offer startup discounts for faculty. So you ask those questions because that makes a huge difference in how much you can get in the beginning to stock your lab.
I have a question with the operating budget. I know that it looks very fluid when you look at it, like, oh, if I don't need equipment, I can put money up here for personnel. But I know sometimes money is earmarked. This is earmarked for equipment, this is earmarked for personnel, and you can't move it between the two pools. Could you talk about that a little bit when
Sure.
we may encounter that and what the rules are for using
Those
this?
rules are typically more aligned with externally sponsored research grants
Okay.
rather than internally sponsored startup.
Okay.
You can't take your startup and buy a boat with it to go sailing. Okay? I don't think that would be nice. But typically startup money is very fluid.
Okay.
It's internal money, it's institutional money, so it's used to start up your lab. You can use it for salary, supplies, equipment, whatever you need to run your lab. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of like a lab meeting. If you go to lab meetings and you have coffee or bagels or donuts or something like that, most likely your institutional money is paying for it. You cannot use your grant money to do that. So there are lots of restrictions on externally funded grant money. Typically with an external grant, when you apply for that grant, you tell the sponsoring agency how you plan to spend that money based on the science that's proposed in that project. They expect you to spend that money as you proposed. You are not allowed to use that money for other purposes. Most agencies allow you to rebudget if something changes in your science and you need something different. So let's say you budgeted supplies, but you find out you need a tabletop PCR machine. You might be able to go back to the sponsor and say, I'd like to take $10,000 out of my supply budget and buy this piece of equipment, which is necessary for the project that I'm working on for this sponsor. Most of those types of activities would be granted. It would take a formal process that you would work through your business office at your department level, and then the central office at the institutional level, and then to the sponsor, and you would be able to do that. On the other hand, other sponsors that we work with are very rigid. They require that you identify specifically what you're going to buy, and they require that you buy it, and you don't deviate from your plan. So, for example, we had a faculty member that had to have fingerprinting done because fingerprinting was required in order to run a specific machine that they needed in order to produce the research for that project. Well, the sponsor considered fingerprinting an administrative cost and refused to pay for it. Well, of course, no one knew this until they refused to pay for it. So at that point, what happens is not only have you charged the sponsor for a cost that they have unallowed, but you've lost that money because you're not allowed to use that money for other purposes. So you do have to be aware of the sponsor's regulations as well as the institutional's regulations, because Duke has additional regulations that we place on some types of funds before you spend your money. So that's a very good question. There are restrictions on certain categories, especially in the area what we call administrative costs, which are things like food, postage, office supplies, fax machines. All of those things are typically not research-related costs. You may need to use those types of services for your lab or for your functions, but they're not allowed on research grants. Operating costs, again, are usually more fluid. It depends on how those operating costs come to you in your startup package. Some of our startup packages come from Whitehead scholarship funds. So the Whitehead Foundation gives a large pot of money to the institution, and then the institution funds new faculty out of that source of funding. Well, it is internal funds, but because it's actually coming from a foundation, it has more restricted expenditures than in pure institutional funds. I might add that if we go back to the F&A discussion, I know you guys are probably tired of F&A, but if there's some of the pilot money that Mariah had talked about, internal pilot money, actually comes from the F&A money because the institution can set aside some of that money in order to sponsor pilot projects. So that's another way that money can come in. So the answer to your question is always know the source of your funds and always ask the resident expert in your department, which should be your business manager, your grant manager, your business manager, or someone in your school office. If you have a question, if you're in doubt, always ask. It's a good way to do it. So let's talk about your research team. When you come in and start your new lab, the first thing you want to do is to hire someone to help you. Well, that sounds very good because, the more people you have focused on a problem, the faster you can solve it, right? The faster you can generate data, the faster you can write papers, the faster you can write grants to get external funding. All of that sounds wonderful. But hiring people or having students in your lab, having postdocs in your lab, takes a big chunk of your time. And you just became a human resource manager. The first time you get ready to hire someone, you just became a manager. Not only do you have to write a job description, because you need to know what that person is going to do, you'll have to get clearance from your HR office, which means that person has to be leveled. You might think they're a high level, they may think they're low level. It'll be depending on that job description that you've selected for that individual. We have to run ads, you have to interview people, you have to check references, you have to do hiring documents, you have to get them on staff and get them on payroll. It sounds like a lot of work, doesn't it? It is a lot of work. Hopefully you will have someone in your area to help you. Your business manager, typically there's a person in your area that also knows HR and employee type information for you to assist you. If it's an international individual, you will also have to consider visa ramifications and the time lag and the cost of submitting visas and all of those activities. So that's an added step to getting people into your lab. But once they get there, let's say you got them on board, they're in your lab, you have to manage them. And the idea that people know what to do and will do it is a great idea. But you still have to manage people. You still have to meet with them, you have to guide them, you have to lay out expectations of what you want them to do, how you want them to perform. You have to determine how you want your data documented. And you have to communicate that to that new person in your lab. Because the way they collect data and record it may be different than the way you were trained to collect data and record it. And this is your opportunity to decide how you want your lab and your research to function. So you have to train all those individuals. If you have animals, you may have to train people in how to manage your animals. So there's a lot of different areas that you will be responsible for as that investigator when it comes to personnel. And always remember that if you take no action, you've taken an action, because no action by default is action. So that's my way of looking at it. If you know you have a problem and you don't address it, because I can assure you that in your career as an HR manager, you will have problematic employees. You will have grad students who don't show up, or grad students who don't do what you expect them to do. You will have research technicians who tell you they have all these skills in their background, but when they walk in the lab, they don't have those skills available. You will have people that were trained on the piece of equipment that's 10 years old and yours just came out of assembly, and so you've got to retrain them on stuff. You will have all kinds of HR issues that you will have to address. If you have an issue, address it early. The last thing you want to do is to have someone in your lab functioning less than expectations. And you're paying their salary and you're not getting full benefit of that FTE. And remember, it's coming out of your startup package or your grants. So it's your responsibility to act and make sure that you manage those folks.
One thing just to add to that is to add to the complexity, and surely I know some of you lived through this, others, if you're lucky, you haven't, and that is the sort of group dynamic. It's not just managing a person and that person's potential issues and challenges of expectations, but how the group interacts and gets along. You want to think about that, actually, I believe, it's what I try to do in mine, is at the stage of hiring. Think about complementary personalities, so you don't want to put people that there's no way they're ever going to be able to effectively work together, because you get a lot of synergy with people that work well together. You could have somebody who's slightly less technically able but end up with a lot more productivity if they're all working together than if they're all really good experts but hate each other's guts and won't talk to each other. Nothing gets done. So if you live in one of those places, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, be very thankful. But they exist out there. And they exist because it's not easy. But if you think about the team as you hire people onto the team, and you think and you have that awareness as it goes along, and you deal with it when you start seeing things happen. You don't just say they'll work it out. They're not kids, they'll work it out. Well, chances are good. The price of they'll work it out is lost productivity in a big way. So it's not just the individuals, but it's that whole team management. It's your research team, and you have to think about that.
From a team concept, you need to understand that what your team is doing, and you need to be involved in managing that team, both from a personnel perspective, but also from a research perspective. You need to make sure that you're planning out your experiments, that you know how much money you have, and that your experiments and money are aligned. Because you can plan all the experiments that you want within 2 months and use all of your research money, and then you've got the remainder of the year open and folks doing whatever they want to do. If you have a lot of people in your lab, if you grow your lab very quickly, and you have lots of people in your lab, let's say you have 2 grad students and a postdoc and a technician, and everybody's on a different line of research, then you could have multiple experiments going on. All great, but again, think about your money. Because if you don't have the money to do that, you may want to plan out your experiments a little bit through a little bit longer period of time, so that everyone can be involved and everyone can be analyzing the information as it goes along. Again, we're going to go back to the animals. In addition to probably one of your larger costs, if this is your model, you also have to have someone who's knowledgeable about managing animals in your lab. And if that's not you, then it's one of your employees. You have to know about animal handling protocols. You have to know about how your institution signs out animals, when you're allowed to keep them in your lab. You have to do your IACUC. Does everybody know what an IACUC is? Animal protocol. Those have to be done annually if you're having an animal model. If you have humans, you have to do IRBs annually as well. A lot of procedure, a lot of infrastructure involved in maintaining an animal colony. Again, we talked about overcrowding cages. That's going to cost you money. We've talked about having too many animals and not euthanizing them in a timely way. That is going to cost you money. If you mishandle an animal, they will shut your research down.
In a heartbeat.
And I can tell you that most people who have an issue with animals have been reported by someone in their lab. That's what we expect our employees to do. If you see mistreatment of an animal or a human in a research model, you are supposed to report that episode to the appropriate office, and they will come in and do an investigation. Everyone will have to go through retraining. It's a requirement. Your protocols may be shut down for a while everybody goes through retraining. So you want to make sure that everyone understands. A lot of times international students will come in and they will have knowledge at their home country, but they may not have knowledge in the U.S. Same thing with a postdoc who's trained at another institution. They should be very similar. The animal handling should be very similar. But institutions may have very specific things that they want you to do. So you need to make sure that everyone in your lab is well trained to manage those animals in your lab. Because if you shut down your animal model, you may lose your work. Worst case scenario, they could damage your experiments and you lose data, and that can, or mishandle your animals and have a viral infection or something. So there's lots of ways to create disasters, which Mariah will talk about later on because she's our disaster control contact for the School of Medicine. But animals are one of those things that can really interrupt your research if you're not very careful. When you hire people, when you hire your research team, there are some things that you can do and there are things that you cannot do. At Duke, we do allow you to pay relocation cost if you have the funds to do that. But it's limited and it's based on IRS rules. So you need to make sure that before you offer a position or before you commit to someone to pay relocation costs, that you know the rules inside your institution and that you will have to pay those costs. So don't make commitments unless you know. Same thing with travel. A lot of folks come into the lab and they have an expectation that they will get one trip per year. Well, that's great if you have one person in your lab. But let's say you have 6 people in your lab. Do you have funding to pay for all 6 people to go to one trip a year? Oh, and by the way, that trip is in Brussels, and the average cost will probably be about $2,800 per person. So be aware of your commitments up front when you talk to your research team and you're recruiting your research team into your office. Be realistic of what you can offer and what you cannot offer. I recently had a discussion with an investigator out of NIEHS, and that's the National Institute of Environmental Health and Sciences out at the part of the National Institutes of Health Institutes. And what he does is he has, I think he said he had 6 people in his lab, and he allows one trip per year for the lab staff. If you are presenting, you get to go. So that's one way to earn yourself a trip. If you're not presenting, if no one's presenting, then he rotates it with the last person or the newest person, the oldest person getting the first option to go on the trip. So he's devised his own way of making sure that he's fair within his lab in providing travel opportunities for folks. And of course, if you have external funding, NIH grants typically come with the ability to allocate funds to travel, and you can support your travel team for that. Some of the smaller foundation grants do not allow for travel. So you need to be aware of that when you start using those types of external funds. Startup packages do allow you to travel. Some institutions, some academic institutions, have restrictions on foreign travel. So you may want to check with your institution before you plan for a foreign trip to see what you have to do in order to be able to travel to a foreign location, even for a conference. Again, you really want to work closely with your business manager. That's their role in your department. Your grant manager and your business manager is to serve as the institutional representative at the departmental level to assist you with all of these issues. If you have a question, you go to them and you ask the question and they can find the answer out for you. Don't assume that you know, and you know, I know a lot of federal regulations that are not logical. So what you think might be logical and reasonable may not be what the feds tell you how to do. So please make sure that you check. So one of the things we do in my department is we actually review the accounts every month. We look at your expenditures. We do what we call reconcile your expenditures, which means that we look at the costs that are charged to your applications or charged to your accounts, and we make sure that those costs are yours and that someone hasn't accidentally used your account or that someone hasn't accidentally used the type of money for some unknown expense. Normally, we would have caught the fingerprinting costs that I mentioned earlier today, but we did not. That was overlooked. And so by the time it got to the sponsor, it was unallowable. But on federal grants, for instance, they do not allow you to charge office supplies to federal grants. Now, everything that I tell you, there will always be an exception, okay? It's just like you cannot charge alcohol to a federal grant. If you are doing research activities that require alcohol, then yes, you can charge it to a federal grant. So there are always exceptions. But as a general rule, there are some things that are unallowable, and your grant manager and your department will review your accounts to make sure that you don't charge it. If they identify a cost, then it will be transferred back to you, to your discretionary code or to your startup code. Now, we haven't talked about discretionary codes. Discretionary codes are somewhat like internal funding. They are typically unrestricted activities that you have earned money for. So let's say that you agreed to go teach a class for another department, and instead of taking that money as payment to you, you ask them to transfer it into your discretionary code. So you would have that money in your discretionary code to use at your discretion. And they're very flexible funds, and you can build these up. Most people are very protective of their discretionary codes because it does allow them to fund extra travel for their labs and things like that. But on a monthly basis, your department should be, and you should be reviewing your accounts. Every code that you have, you should have some knowledge of how much money you expect to be in that code, how much is coming in, how much have you spent, how much do you need to spend, and what the balance is. So let's say you have a one-year grant, $50,000, 10% of your salary, 50% of a technician, and $10,000 worth of supplies. And a piece of equipment shows up on that account. Should be a red flag. One, did you order it? Is it your equipment or is it your neighbor's? Number two, did you use the wrong fund code? Did you really mean to buy it off of your federal project instead of off of this foundation project? Number three, if you want it to be on there and you don't have a budget for it, you have to backtrack and put some paperwork in place to ask that sponsor, can you rebudget money from one category in there to cover that equipment? And if they say yes, that's fine. But then guess what? You have less money in another category. So you no longer have 10% of your salary, 50% of a technician, and $10,000 worth of research supplies because you just bought a $5,000 piece of equipment. So that money has to come from somewhere. So you have to adjust your spending patterns on that project. You have to do that for every grant that you have, every account that you have, whether it's startup, research grant, discretionary, whatever. You need to monitor what's coming in, what's going out, what you have planned to go out, how long it's going to last you, because those startup funds will not last you forever. Depending on your spending patterns, they could be gone in 2 years, could be gone in 3 years, depending on your spending patterns and how many other grants you have coming in. Who do you go for help? Your business manager or your grant manager. There's always someone there to help you. You are never alone in all of this. They will be there to help you. So we're going to talk about applying for grants, and I can talk on this for probably 2 or 3 hours, but I won't. I'm going to do some highlights, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Most of our grants at Duke are from the federal government, especially in the School of Medicine where I've always worked. About 70 to 75% of our grants are from NIH. So we do a lot of business with the federal government. They predominantly fund our support. NSF does a lot of business with the university, and the university has a little different portfolio. They're about 30% NSF, 25% NIH, and then they have a lot of other different types of federal agencies and foundation grants. The School of Medicine has a little bit more focused portfolio. We also do a lot of grants with commercial companies, industry. We do both clinical, as Mariah had mentioned earlier, but we also do basic science. My chair just got an industry grant to do some work developing a transgenic mouse. So everybody does a little bit different type of research, and how you apply, you have to identify what groups will fund your area of research. And as Mariah indicated, you have to apply for the grants that they want to fund. That may or may not be exactly what you're doing, but if you submit an unsolicited grant to an agency that doesn't fund your research, you've just wasted your time. So you want to make sure that you maximize your time by submitting grants to agencies that will fund your type of research. You can always know what they will fund. Their website will tell you, everything's online these days. Their website will tell you, NIH does, every year they actually list the types of interest they have. They also issue solicitations for research on a weekly basis. So if you know what you want to do, you can actually submit applications. There's also a lot of public databases that you could go to do searches on who supports your type of research. Other places you can check is with your mentor. Because if your research is like their research, then most likely you're going to be submitting applications at the same places that your mentor or your colleagues in this field will be submitting their research. The more opportunities that you have from funding sources, the better opportunity you will have of being funded. NIH is funding somewhere between 10 and 15 percentile these days. It is very tough to get NIH grants. You can get, you may be able to get a Career Development Award, which was one of the K awards. It's really tough to get your first R01. It takes a while to get those. I've known folks that have gone their entire startup package and not be able to get an R01 funded. And recently I was talking with another institution, and they have people that have gone their entire tenure time and not obtained an R01. So times are really tough now for those types of funding. So you really do need to be strategic in bringing in external money from a lot of different sources. And yes, it may be a $10,000 grant or a $25,000 grant or a $50,000 grant, but if you string enough $50,000 grants together, then you can fund your research. But it does take work, and that's why we say you're going to have to focus on money a lot. The different types of mechanisms that are NIH, and I talk in mechanism language, so if I say something you don't understand, please ask. Typically the K awards are where people start their career development awards. Those are usually 5-year awards. They pay up to $75,000 worth of salary. They require 75% commitment of effort, and they give you very little research dollars, usually around $25,000. But those are typically where people first apply for grants. The next step would be an R01. We used to have R21s, which were smaller grants, 2 to 3 year grants, $250,000 grants. A lot of the institutes no longer are providing R21s. They may have specific solicitations for certain types of research in R21s, but there's no longer a general institute-wide R21s. The R01 is the real research-based grant. Typically, if you're a new investigator, it's going to be for 5 years. It's the modular grants, which is a terminology that NIH uses. They give you money in modules of $25,000. That's why it's called modular. They will give you up to 10 modules or $250,000 over a period of 5 years if you're a new investigator. But you're not limited to $250,000. If your research involves very expensive research activities such as a large animal colony or sequencing, you may have to go over that $250,000 modular grant and do what you call a categorical grant, which is where you identify all of your expenses. So it's just a different way of submitting a research application from the budget standpoint. There's no difference from the science standpoint. And your central office can help you decide what is best to do. There are UO1s, which are typically clinical, they have a clinical component to them. UO1s are typically patient involved, patient research involved, similar to an RO1, but have patients with them. And then once you get past the R mechanisms, which are the research grants, you go into program project grants. So another opportunity is if you are working with a group of other investigators and they're putting in a program project grant, then you can be the PI on one of the projects inside of a program project grant. So look for collaborations between your colleagues, both in your institution as well as external to your institution, because you could actually be the sub-project leader on a program project grant at a different institution and have the work done at your institution. So NIH has a lot of different mechanisms, a lot of different ways to apply for funds coming into the institution and into your program. There's lots of foundations, some very small, some very large, some very structured, some very restricted, some very unrestricted. The best thing to find out is to talk to your colleagues, talk to your business manager, because one of the things I do for my faculty is I go back and I look at all the grants that we've had for the last 5 years. And if I have a grant from Dana Foundation, then I'm going to tell my new faculty, why don't you look at Dana Foundation and see if they will fund your research? If I have a grant from Gates Foundation, then Gates, I'm going to ask them to look at their solicitations and see if they can apply for Gates. There's American Heart, American Cancer, there's March of Dimes. There's a ton of foundations out there. Some of them are very disease specific or area specific, but you need to expand your research into all different types of foundations to see if they will sponsor your research. Again, industry, don't mark out industry if you're basic science, because you can create collaborations with industry and partner with them to do research. And typically they're a little bit more generous with their dollars than some of the other sponsoring agencies. One of the things they don't like is our F&A. I don't know why they don't like it, because they have 100% F&A, but they don't tell you that. They don't understand that. They have to pay for their buildings. They have to pay for their research labs. They have to pay for their administration, their utilities, the same way we do. So why they don't understand that we have to do that as well, I don't know. But they usually object to our F&A. But they are required to pay it just like any other sponsor if they want us to use our facilities to help them develop their research activities. I do want to take a sidestep right here and mention something. Some industries will want you to be a consultant. And every institution has a little bit tweaky definition, but you need to know the constraints within your institution. So I will tell you what Duke's constraints are, and then if you go outside of Duke, you'll need to know that. Duke's rules allow faculty to consult up to 4 days a month. So you can take your time up to 4 days a month, and you can consult with anyone. You don't necessarily have to tell us or ask permission to do that, because that's part of our faculty rules. However, if you do consult with an outside entity, you have to declare it on your conflict of interest. You don't have to ask permission, but you do have to inform us that you've done that and that you've received money for it, if you've received money. When you're consulting, you cannot use Duke's resources to do it. So you can't run an experiment for an outside entity in your lab and then charge them a consulting fee that gets paid to you. Cannot do that. So be careful about your relationships, because some industry will want you to consult, and they'll say, we'll give you $20,000 to attend, 6 days the month of December at our facility. Well, your 6 days has just gone over the 4 days of the month. So be careful that you don't put yourself in a position where there's number one, there's a potential conflict of interest. And if you think there is a conflict of interest, you should always discuss that with someone in the Research Integrity Office. But don't put yourself in a position where you can be conflicted by the activities that you do, and that what you think is consulting is actually work for hire at Duke. Make sure you understand the difference. So consulting is external to your organization, no resources utilized from your organization. It is your own personal time. It is paid to you. You will be responsible for income taxes. And most industry groups these days are required to post your name on a public website that you have consulted with their organization. So make sure that you are aware of that as well. But if that industry group wants you to do research and you're doing research for them and they're going to pay you to do that, then that's fine. That comes through Duke, needs to have a research agreement in place. All sponsored projects have very structured, approved processes. You have to apply for a grant through the institution. It has to be signed off by the institutional central office. The award will come back to the institution. It will have Duke's name on it, not your name. It's paid to Duke. Duke owns that project. And then we will set it, we read the terms of the agreement. We may negotiate the terms. We sign the agreement, and then we issue an account code that you can use in your lab to use that money. The other thing you have to be careful about is money, because you can get a grant for $100,000. That $100,000 has milestones. You can only spend the amount of money up to the milestone. If you spend over the milestone or you never meet the milestone, then you may not get that money. So make sure there are contract terms here, expectations that you have to meet. If that milestone is a report, let's say it's an annual report. Let's say it's $500,000 over 5 years. The milestone is an annual report. And you spend $100,000 in the first year, but you don't turn in your annual report. Something happened, your animals got a virus, you weren't able to conduct your experiments, nothing happened, you didn't turn in the report. Who's responsible for that money? If that outside entity won't pay you for that work, who's responsible for that money? So if you have obligations, and you always will have obligations under your research contracts, you need to understand what those are, and you need to meet those milestones in order to get paid and to continue the work. That is the responsibility of the faculty member. And then, as Mariah had mentioned earlier, internal to Duke, lots of places to get funding internal to Duke. Most major programs have pilot programs, and you should search these out and look for them and ask for money. Even other institutions have program project grants that solicit pilot projects throughout the U.S. So always look for these smaller projects that sort of fit into your area, that have very limited amounts of application material that you have to provide. Usually it's a 5-page write-up of your research and what your plan is. It's not the full-blown 15-page application that you have to do for NIH. Where do you find all of these? You find them all over the web. You find them in your lab. You find them with your colleagues. You find them with your business manager. You find them when you go to meetings. You look around. You find them. And you will be actively seeking these throughout your career. It is one of those things that you have to actively pursue all the time. You are either writing a grant, or you are thinking about writing the grant, or you just finished writing the grant and you're writing the paper and then you're going to write the next grant, right? That's what your academic career is going to be like if you're trying to fund a large lab on an ongoing basis. At the bottom, the COS, that's the Community of Science. You can log into that huge database. It has all of the funding sites. Duke University does a really nice thing for faculty. We have an internal funding opportunities website. We also have staffing that can help you. They can meet with you one-on-one, talk about your area of research, and then go do searches for you to help find research opportunities, funding opportunities for you that you might be able to apply to based on where you are within your career. Applying for grants. This is the brief portion of applying for grants. And most of you, have most of you applied for your first fellowship? NSF fellowships? And NRSA fellowships? American Heart fellowships? Lots of people start with fellowships. But applying for grants is really simple from an administrative point of view. You read the instructions, you follow the instructions, you write toward the instructions, you review the instructions, and then you submit according to the instructions. If you follow the instructions, you're fine. If you don't follow the instructions, if you think you know it or you want to do it a little bit differently, you're not fine. I've been doing this a long time, and one of the things I'm always surprised with is when people say, I always say, give the first thing, when you say, I want to submit a grant, I say, give me the instructions. Because that tells me what I need to know, tells me how to do it. Grants are all over the board these days. Most are electronic. NIH, we submit here at Duke University, we submit electronically to NIH. We don't use the little PDF. So make sure you know how your institution submits grants. It's very important because you don't want to waste your energy, your time on putting together something that doesn't fit the model that your school is using. For someone who knows how to do grants, it's very easy. So you need to identify the administrator in your area early on and let them know that you're going to apply for a grant. So one of the things my staff will do is that we solicit information from our faculty. Do you have plans to submit a grant? It's either that or you get a call from the chair and she says, you do plan to submit a grant for the next deadline, don't you? And either answer is okay with us, but we plan ahead because typically you may have a very small staff that do grants in your area that actually put them together for you. And we have multiple faculty that we have to serve, so we have to make sure that we stagger them. It's an easy process if you follow the instructions. If you have someone knowledgeable in your area to assist you to do that, you've got things like bio sketches that have to be very specific on how you put those together. They have to be, in a certain order. You have to have a certain number of publications depending on what agency you're submitting to. All those little details you don't really have to worry about if you've got a good grant manager that can help you through it. If you are on your own, then my advice is to read the instructions and follow the instructions. The science, that's all yours. I know that sounds like a simple advice to read the instructions, but it's really where you will fall is that you did not do something that the instructions told you to do. The science is all yours. You will be doing that. That is what you should be focusing on, not all the administrative stuff surrounding the application. So that's why you should ask for help. The budget, you have to think about the budget. You have to create a budget, and that can be difficult for some folks, but if you've created your operating budget for your lab, you will have a sense of what you need in order to do your research. if you are looking at your monthly financial statements, you will understand how you are spending your money in order to do your research. So I can tell you that I could put together a budget for you in 10 minutes. Because I know how to do a budget. You might struggle for 3 days to get a budget down on paper that feels comfortable to you. So before you start struggling for 3 days, go ask for some help, because we can take a look at your spending pattern and tell you what your budget should be, not what you want your budget to be, okay? Because I've had faculty that say they want all of them, they want $200,000 in salary because they want to hire a bunch of people, and they want $25,000 in supplies. Well, guess what? They're not doing Drosophila research, they're doing mouse research, which means they need about $150,000 in salary and about $75,000 in supplies for those mice. So you have to be realistic in your budget, or you will be your dollars will be misaligned with your science, and you won't be able to do the work that you're proposing to do. So be realistic on your budget. The environment and resources is another thing that you should work on immediately when you start your lab. Don't do it for a specific grant. When you go to your lab and you start your research career, write out your resources and environment. Resources and environment is what you have in your lab to do what you need to do, what shared facilities you have available to you that's required for you to do what you need to do. You know, confocal microscope facility is available, the DLAR is available. You want to convince the reviewers of your application that not only do you know what you are doing scientifically, but you have the resources available to you immediately to be successful at doing that research project. You want to write your equipment down, your shared resources, and if there's a unique environment where you are, if you have, this happens a lot with laser type activities. If there's a unique facility that's unique to Duke or unique to your institute that may not be available anywhere else, you certainly want that part of your resources and environment to ensure that the reviewers know that you have everything accessible to you.
I'm going to tag it because I've got two problems that I'm dealing with now in my job. If the resources are not available to you that you need to do the research, whether it means you put in that you're going to get this very expensive piece of equipment, but it requires very special space, or space at all that you don't have, you must talk to your department so they understand that. I have one right now where they need to buy this very special piece of equipment. We have no space on campus to put this thing. I mean, they've got the grant. We have nowhere to put it because they didn't bring it to anybody's attention that there was any special need. And I'm like, we're all like going, and I've got another one where it's not special need, but it's beyond the capacity of their footprint of their lab. Their department's trying to help them, but they didn't bring it to the attention of the department. So they just assumed if I get the grant, they'll make it available to me without ever having that conversation in front. That's not a good approach, because depending on the institution, they may not, if space may be incredibly tight, it may just not be available. And that's a hard reality. That's a real reality. So know what's available, and if you're proposing to do something that you do not have the resources currently available, you need to be talking to somebody so the institution understands they have to make something available to make that research work. That's really important.
The last thing, we talked about directs and we talked about indirects a lot. The only thing in an application format I want you to be absolutely positively you do, the first thing, is when they tell you how much money they're going to give you, do they say direct? Do they say total? Because if they say we will give you $500,000 total cost, then you have to subtract out 57% of that for indirects. If they tell you they give you $500,000 direct cost, then you add 57% to that for indirects. Very, very important upfront calculation you need to know. A lot of difference between what you can do with that kind of money. Okay, we're about to run short on time, and we have other slides, and this happens every time, so we plan for it. We're never sure where the audience wants to go and what type of questions they want. So we can continue to talk about the sponsored research, how it will be set up and what you have to do internally. Or we can jump to any of the other slides. And I guess you guys didn't get the slides. So we have disaster management services, if you have any questions about that. The remaining is talking about, again, managing cost in your lab, managing surpluses or overdrafts. What do you do when you come up against those types of things? And primarily how to be successful in starting up your lab and being a first-time investigator and having to manage your own research program independently in your area. Any recommendations?
Can you talk about what happens if you're over budget or under budget?
Yeah. If you overspend your budget or underspend your budget? Good question. So it depends on the type of budget, what the funding source is for that budget. But most likely, if you are over budget, that's worse than being under budget. So let's do under budget first. If you're under budget, if you haven't spent all your money and it's from an external source, then you can usually ask for what they call a no-cost extension. And you tell them that you know, for some scientific reason, because your sponsor is going to assume that the budget that you asked for, the cost that you asked for to do the research you proposed was spent to do that research. And if you did not spend it under budget, you're now under budget, then what happened to the research you proposed? So the costs are always associated with the research unless there's a disaster. So you would write the sponsor and say, for this reason, my research didn't progress as quickly. I had to redo some experiments. I had to buy new animals or whatever, and I would like to have a no-cost extension. And most of these are granted. They give you an extra 12 months to spend the money, or the amount of time that you need to spend the money so that you can continue the research. If you are over budget, number one, that should not be a surprise. If you are going over budget, you should know that well in advance, at least 6 months in advance, unless you've had, a disaster. I would suggest that you go talk to your business manager, explain why you're over budget, and ultimately you will have to talk to your chair, because the chair is the only one in your department that has the ability to commit funds to pay for things that the investigator cannot pay. There may be things that your department can do to help you manage your funds a little bit better. It may be that you have to slow your research down. If you're overspent, it means that you're spending too much, and it means that you may have to let go one of the lab people, one of your technicians, or a postdoc. You may have to release them from your lab, or you have to slow your experiments down. You will have to make adjustments to spend within the money that you have for your research activities. Not a good place to be, but it should not be unexpected. It should be planned. Any other questions? Okay, I think we're out of time, all right? Yeah. So thank you all very much. We appreciate it.